A sharp bang rattled the thin walls, and Lena felt her chest jolt as if the sound had struck her from the inside. She pulled her knees tight, listening to her mother pacing in the next room, muttering words that slipped between anger and despair. The air felt heavy, smelling of old dust and cold rain drifting in through a cracked window. Lena whispered to herself that it would calm down soon, though she already knew it wouldn't. Mara's steps grew louder, her voice rising until it broke into a strained laugh that made Lena flinch. She wondered what had pushed her mother so far this time, what heavy secret twisted her voice. When Mara finally called her name, the tone carried something unfamiliar, something that made Lena's skin prickle. She stepped into the hallway, watching Mara turn toward her with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, and felt a question burn in her mind she hadn't dared ask before. The storm settled into a steady hum, and Lena felt the air sink into an eerie calm that made every small noise feel amplified. Mara moved from room to room, opening drawers, shutting cabinets, muttering to herself as though rehearsing something she didn't want to say aloud. Lena followed her with her eyes, trying to read her movements, noticing how Mara kept glancing toward the window where that distant figure had appeared. It wasn't unusual for strangers to pass through the outskirts of town, but something in her mother's stare told Lena this wasn't a passing worry. Mara's hands trembled slightly as she fumbled with a worn envelope, tucking it into her pocket, before turning toward Lena with a forced, brittle smile that only made the silence heavier. Mara finally stopped moving and sat on the edge of the bed, staring at her hands as though they held the answer to something unbearable. Lena waited for her to speak, but the silence stretched on until it pressed against the walls. She stepped closer, unsure whether to reach out or back away. Mara's breathing hitched, and she whispered something Lena couldn't catch, her voice cracking on the last syllable. The storm outside rumbled again, and Lena felt the vibration through the floorboards. She wondered why her mother looked both terrified and strangely resolute, as if she had made a decision she couldn't undo. When Mara finally looked up, her expression held a pleading sorrow that made Lena's heart twist. Lena sat beside Mara, leaving a thin strip of fabric between them. Mara wiped her eyes quickly, attempting to straighten her posture, but the effort only made her look more fragile. She spoke in short phrases, each one fading before reaching its end, as though she feared the weight of her own words. Lena leaned in, catching scattered fragments that hinted at danger, debt, and something about not having another choice. The room felt colder with each broken sentence. Lena's stomach tightened as she realized her mother wasn't just frightened. She was preparing for something that involved Lena more deeply than she had ever admitted. Mara's voice cracked again, and she stopped talking altogether, leaving Lena drowning in unspoken dread. When Mara finally stood, the sudden movement startled Lena. She watched as her mother crossed the room, opened the bottom drawer, and pulled out a faded coat. Her hands shook as she smoothed its sleeves, the sound of fabric rustling louder than the wind outside. Mara told Lena they needed to leave, her tone carrying no room for argument. Lena felt a hollow sensation form in her chest, sensing this wasn't a simple errand. She hesitated at the doorway, glancing back at the cluttered room as if it might explain what was happening. Mara urged her again, impatience rising beneath her fragile urgency. Lena followed, each step feeling heavier than the last, as though she were being led towards something she wasn't meant to understand yet. Lena followed Mara down the creaking steps, each footfall echoing louder than it should in the damp morning air. A thin mist crawled across the yard, softening the shapes of the broken fence and the tire tracks carved into the dirt. Mara kept her head down, walking fast, her coat flapping in the wind as if she feared stopping long enough for Lena to question her. Lena tried to make sense of the strange urgency, the way her mother's breathing hitched whenever she glanced over her shoulder. They reached the gravel road where silence pressed in thickly, broken only by distant crows circling above the fields. Mara whispered that someone was waiting, her voice too flat for comfort. Lena felt a tremor run through her as she tried to imagine what her mother had done. Knowing the answer would be worse than anything she imagined, they walked farther than Lena expected, the road narrowing until the fog thickened into an almost solid sheet. Mara muttered directions under her breath, words too quiet to follow, leaving Lena to piece together meaning from fragments. A chilled uneasiness spread through her as they approached an abandoned shed, leaning against a cluster of crooked trees. Mara stopped suddenly, lifting a hand to signal silence, her breath coming faster. Lena listened closely, hearing only the soft drip of moisture from the shed's rusted roof and the distant hum of wind moving through the fields. Mara whispered that they needed to wait, her voice trembling slightly. Lena stepped back instinctively, wishing she understood why the fear in her mother's voice seemed aimed at more than just the morning fog. A distant engine rumbled through the fog, low and uneven, vibrating faintly through the ground. Mara stiffened immediately, clutching Lena's wrist with a force that made her flinch. She whispered that they needed to be ready, though she didn't say what for. Lena's pulse hammered as she looked toward the road, seeing nothing but shifting gray layers. The engine grew louder, its rhythm steadying into a slow advance that carried an unsettling certainty. Lena tugged her hand gently, trying to free herself, but Mara only tightened her grip. The sound drew closer, shaping itself into something heavy, something deliberate. When the faint outline of a large vehicle began to break through the fog, Lena felt the air leave her lungs, sensing that the moment she feared without fully understanding had finally arrived. The vehicle slowed to a crawl before stopping several yards away, engine idling in a deep growl. Mara released Lena's wrist at last, but the sudden freedom only made Lena feel more exposed. The driver's door opened with a heavy metallic creak, and a tall silhouette stepped out. Though the fog kept his features hidden, Mara straightened her posture, smoothing her coat with nervous hands as though preparing for an introduction Lena never asked for. The figure stood still for a long moment, before taking a few deliberate steps forward, boots crunching softly on gravel. Lena felt the weight of his presence even before his face came into view, sensing he wasn't a stranger to the emptiness of these roads. She drew in a shaky breath as Mara whispered something that made her blood run cold. "Just let me talk first." Darius stopped a short distance away, the fog thinning just enough for Lena to catch the outline of his eyes watching her closely. Mara stepped forward first, words spilling too quickly as she tried to explain something Lena couldn't hear. Darius listened with a stillness that felt unnatural in the trembling morning air. Lena shivered, unsure whether he was the danger or merely the next piece of whatever her mother had set in motion. Mara gestured toward Lena, her arms shaking, her voice cracking as she forced a strained smile. Darius finally shifted his gaze from Mara to Lena, and something unreadable flickered across his expression. In that moment, Lena realized this meeting had been planned long before she understood it existed, and she felt the world tilt beneath her feet. Lena kept a careful distance as Mara and Darius moved farther from the truck, their voices low and sharp beneath the fading fog. Every few seconds, Darius glanced toward her, his expression unreadable but steady, as if weighing truths she hadn't been allowed to hear. Mara's words spilled out in frantic bursts, her hands shifting restlessly, her tone wavering between pleading and defensiveness. Lena strained to catch pieces of the conversation, but the wind carried them away, leaving only hints of desperation drifting through the cold air. Something in the way Mara avoided her gaze made Lena's stomach twist with a quiet dread. She sensed that the ground beneath her life was shifting, and every step closer to them felt like stepping into a story she never agreed to be part of. When Darius suddenly fell silent and looked directly at her, Lena felt a chill ripple down her spine. Darius asked Mara a question sharp enough to slice through the fog, and Lena felt its weight, even without hearing every word. Mara stiffened, her face twisting in a mixture of fear and anger, her hands fluttering as if trying to catch the right explanation before it slipped away. Lena stepped closer, drawn by the rising tension, her breath unsteady as she watched her mother shake her head helplessly. Darius's posture changed, less confrontational, more resigned, as though he'd expected the truth but still hated hearing it. Lena's heart pounded harder with each second, sensing that whatever they were discussing involved her far more deeply than either wanted to admit. When Mara finally turned toward Lena, her eyes glistening with something close to guilt, Lena felt the world tighten around her. Mara took a shaky breath and began to speak directly to Lena, her voice cracking as she tried to form the truth she had avoided for so long. Lena felt each word land like a stone, forming a weight she didn't know how to carry. The explanation was disjointed. Something about danger, debt, threats that had followed them for months. Lena tried to piece it together, but every sentence opened another gap in the story, making her feel both closer to understanding and farther from safety. Darius didn't interrupt. He only listened, arms crossed, his expression tightening with every detail. Lena watched her mother unravel before her, realizing the desperation behind her actions ran deeper than simple cruelty. Still, the pain of betrayal burned too strongly to ignore. She tried to respond, but her voice failed her, disappearing into the cold air as Mara reached toward her with trembling hands. The fog broke briefly as a gust swept through the clearing, carrying Mara's breathless confession into open space. She explained that the people threatening her had demanded more than money, that Lena had somehow become the only bargaining chip left. Lena's stomach twisted as she tried to understand how her mother had allowed fear to grow into something this monstrous. Darius shifted his weight, the gravel crunching beneath his boots, and Lena noticed the subtle tension in his jaw as he processed Mara's confession. The silence following her words seemed too large, too heavy, pressing down on Lena until her knees felt weak. She wanted to scream, to run, to deny the truth, but her voice remained trapped in her chest. Mara reached toward her again, silently pleading for forgiveness she hadn't earned. But Lena stepped back, unable to bridge the widening divide. Lena barely noticed when Darius stepped closer, positioning himself between her and Mara with a calmness that felt strangely protective. Mara protested weakly, insisting she hadn't meant for any of this to happen, but her voice lacked conviction. Lena watched the two of them desperately, trying to understand why Darius looked at her with something resembling concern rather than cold intent. He spoke quietly, his voice grounded and steady, telling Mara that the situation had gone too far. Lena felt something unfamiliar ease into her chest. Not trust, not yet, but a sense that Darius wasn't the threat she had feared. Mara's face crumpled as she realized she no longer controlled the moment. Lena wrapped her arms around herself, feeling the truth finally settle. Her life had been shifting for months, and today it had finally cracked open. The tension in the air thickened as Lena watched Mara's fragile form slump against the truck, her eyes glassy with regret and desperation. Darius stood beside her, his expression unreadable, but Lena could see something had changed. She wasn't sure what to feel anymore. Anger, fear, confusion. But a quiet sense of betrayal gnawed at her, sharper than before. Mara's admission had shattered the walls of the story Lena had tried so desperately to believe, and now nothing seemed safe. She took a hesitant step back, her mind racing with the thought that maybe there was a way out of this. That if she could run, if she could just escape, maybe she could find something, anything else. But before she could take another step, a faint sound in the distance froze her in place, an engine sputtering to life in the far field. Her heart leapt into her throat. She was no longer alone in this decision. Lena's eyes darted between Mara and Darius, trying to gauge their next move, but all she could hear was the distant hum of the approaching vehicle growing closer. She didn't wait for them to make a decision. She couldn't. Her legs moved before her mind could fully comprehend the danger, her body propelled by the raw instinct to survive. As she broke into a run, the ground beneath her feet felt uneven, the cold air rushing past her ears like the blur of her own racing thoughts. Her heart pounded in her chest, each beat urging her to keep going, to escape whatever this was before it closed in around her. She barely registered Darius' voice calling after her, too muffled by the wind and her own panic. All that mattered now was distance. The sound of Lena's footsteps was muffled by the thickening mist as she pushed forward, desperate to outrun the choices that had been made for her. Her chest tightened, each breath growing shallow, but she couldn't slow down. Not now. The road ahead stretched long and uncertain, the familiar landscape of home now a blur of shadows and half-formed shapes. She stumbled over rocks, barely catching herself, but kept moving. Her mind flashed back to the moment when she first realized her mother's actions had never been motivated by love, but by fear. A fear that had festered into something much worse. As she rounded a bend in the road, she thought she saw a figure ahead. Someone was waiting for her. Her heart stopped for a moment, hope rising before doubt crept in. She couldn't trust anyone now, not even herself. Lena's breath hitched as the shadowy figure ahead became clearer. It wasn't who she expected. The stranger was tall, cloaked in a dark coat that billowed around him, his face obscured by the hood. The unmistakable sound of boots crunching gravel sent a fresh wave of panic through her. She pivoted, about to turn back, but the approaching figure's voice froze her in place. It was Darius. "Lena, stop." His tone wasn't harsh, but it was firm, and the finality of his words struck a chord deep within her. Her chest tightened, torn between the urge to flee and the sense that there was something she needed to understand. Darius' presence was too much like a lifeline in this mess, but the fear of trusting him still lingered. She hesitated, still caught in the pull of flight. Darius stepped closer, his boots silent against the gravel, and Lena's heart raced with uncertainty. His face, hardened by years of something Lena couldn't understand, softened just enough to show the flicker of something else. A deeper concern, perhaps, or guilt. She stepped back instinctively, unsure if she could allow herself to trust him. He stopped, watching her with a gaze that didn't demand an answer, only waited. The wind shifted, carrying the sharp scent of rain, and for the first time, Lena noticed how distant the road had become. Her only path forward now lay in the choices made between them, and she couldn't see the way clear. Darius spoke quietly, the words firm but not unkind. "Mara can't protect you from what's coming. I'm here to help, but you have to stop running." The weight of his words pressed against her chest like a challenge she couldn't refuse. Lena stared at Darius, the mist curling around them like a veil trying to pull them apart. His words echoed in her mind, heavy with warnings she didn't fully understand. She felt the weight of everything pressing down. Mara's betrayal, the strange danger stalking their steps, the uncertainty of who Darius really was. Before she could respond, a distant rumble drifted through the trees, deeper and harsher than the earlier engine she'd heard. Darius turned sharply, his eyes narrowing as if he'd been expecting this. Lena's pulse quickened. The air grew tighter, carrying a sense of urgency that made her skin prickle. Darius stepped closer, urging her to follow. But Lena hesitated, torn between fear and the faint hope that he might be telling the truth. Another rumble echoed louder this time, and Lena realized the danger wasn't just coming. It was almost here. Lena stumbled back as Darius motioned her behind him, his voice low but urgent, telling her they had to move now. She wanted to ask what was coming, who he was protecting her from, but the words tangled in her throat. Mara had spoken of danger, of people she owed, but their shapes had remained shadows in Lena's mind until this moment. The growing roar of engines cut through the mist like a warning, and Lena felt her heartbeat match their rhythm. Darius started toward the narrow path, glancing back to ensure she followed. For a moment she stayed still, uncertainty rooting her in place, but the fear of the unseen threat finally pushed her forward. As she ran after him, she felt the world closing in, every step echoing the truth that whatever hunted them was now real, and close. Branches whipped against Lena's arms as she followed Darius deeper into the trees. Every sound seemed sharpened. The crunch of their footsteps, the rasp of her breath, the distant growl of engines threading through the fog. Darius slowed only when the forest thickened enough to hide them, placing a hand on a fallen tree as he crouched to listen. Lena crouched beside him, her chest still heaving, trying to silence her breathing. The engines stopped suddenly, their abrupt silence more terrifying than their roar. Lena swallowed hard, feeling the weight of the moment press against her ribs. Darius whispered that they weren't safe yet. His tone wasn't panicked, but Lena could hear something else beneath it. Something like guilt. She wondered what role he had played in this story before she ever knew his name. Moments later, the sharp crack of a twig echoed from somewhere beyond the fog, too deliberate to be an animal. Lena tensed. Darius reached out instinctively, steadying her as he scanned the dense trees. Lena's mind spiraled with fear. She thought of Mara, of the decisions that had dragged her into this chaos, and wondered if her mother had known how dangerous these people truly were. Darius whispered that they had to keep moving, his tone soft but commanding. Lena hesitated, unable to decide if following him was a mistake or her only chance. Another sound snapped through the silence, closer this time. The fear crushed whatever doubt remained. She nodded, letting Darius guide her around a cluster of roots as they slipped deeper into the forest's shadows. They moved until the forest opened into a small ravine carved by years of quiet rain. Darius paused near the ridge, checking the path behind them. Lena leaned against a tree, her breath catching as she tried to steady herself. She didn't understand why these people cared so much about finding her, why she was worth all this danger. Darius finally turned toward her, his expression softer but shadowed with something like regret. He admitted quietly that he had known about the threats longer than Mara realized, that he had tried to stop things before they reached this point. Lena's heart sank. She wasn't sure if his confession made her safer or more vulnerable. The distant sound of men calling out broke the moment, their voices echoing through the ravine. Darius straightened, urgency returning. Lena braced herself, realizing the danger wasn't fading. It was closing in. The ravine funneled the voices of the men behind them, their shouts bouncing off stone walls and filling the air with a chilling urgency. Lena tightened her grip on a tree root as Darius urged her forward, guiding her along a narrow ledge slick with moisture. The weight of his earlier confession pressed heavily in her chest. She didn't know whether to be angry or relieved, but there was no time to untangle the knot of emotions. Her legs trembled as she followed him upward, each step carrying her deeper into the unknown. The forest seemed to hold its breath, leaves swaying softly with the passing wind. As they neared the top, Lena saw a faint light ahead, daylight breaking through the dense canopy. It felt like the first sign of hope in hours, and yet fear clung to her, whispering that danger wasn't far behind. They reached the ridge, and Lena collapsed against a fallen trunk, her lungs burning as she fought to regain her breath. Darius scanned the forest behind them, his expression hardening as the distant voices faded, but didn't disappear. He knelt beside her, speaking quietly, telling her they needed help, someone who could intervene before those men caught up again. Lena's heartbeat slowed as she watched him, realizing he was no longer hiding the urgency or the fear beneath his calm exterior. When he mentioned a woman named Tova, someone who had tried to help Mara months ago, Lena felt a spark of curiosity. Why hadn't her mother gone to her? Darius didn't answer directly, only saying they had to reach her before the day turned dark. The thought of another unknown figure frightened Lena, but staying here frightened her more. Lena followed Darius through a series of overgrown paths, each step leading them farther from the ravine, and closer to the faint hope he described. The forest thinned gradually, allowing more light to seep through, until the world felt less suffocating. Darius slowed only when the old trail widened into a clearing filled with tall grasses swaying gently in a passing breeze. He told Lena they were close now, that Tova's cabin sat beyond the next rise. The name lingered in Lena's mind, stirring questions she was afraid to voice. Why had Mara avoided someone who could have helped her? Was there more to her mother's desperation than she understood? As they walked, Lena noticed Darius' shoulders relax slightly, as though reaching this place carried meaning for him too. For the first time, she wondered if he carried his own regrets into this moment. Now, they climbed the small rise until a cabin emerged through the trees, a weathered structure with smoke curling faintly from its chimney. Lena slowed, her heart pounding with a fragile mix of hope and uncertainty. Darius motioned for her to stay behind him as they approached, tapping lightly on the door. For a moment, everything stood still. Then the door creaked open, revealing a woman with calm, steady eyes that seemed to read Lena's fear instantly. Tova's voice was warm but firm as she asked what had happened. Darius hesitated, glancing at Lena with an unspoken request for trust. Lena stepped forward, her voice trembling as she said they needed help. Tova's expression shifted, softening, deepening, and Lena felt something inside her loosen, as if she had finally reached a place that might hold answers. Inside the cabin, Lena sat near the hearth, comforted by the faint warmth radiating from the fire. Tova brewed tea at a small wooden table, her movements measured and calm. Darius stood near the window watching the forest, as if expecting shadows to break free from the trees at any moment. When Tova finally sat beside Lena, her voice softened as she asked her to explain everything. Lena tried, but the words tangled painfully at first, every detail reopening wounds she'd barely begun to recognize. Tova listened carefully, her eyes steady with empathy that felt unfamiliar to Lena. When she finished, Tova placed a gentle hand over hers and promised that she wasn't alone anymore. Darius turned from the window, his expression heavy with relief. For the first time in days, Lena felt the smallest spark of something like safety. The warmth of the cabin felt fragile, like a thin barrier holding back the storm waiting outside. Lena sat close to the fire, her hands wrapped around the mug Tova had given her, but the trembling wouldn't stop. Darius kept glancing through the window as if time were slipping faster than he could hold it. Tova spoke softly, explaining that the men searching for them wouldn't give up easily. Not with what Mara owed. Not with the promises that had been broken. Lena's chest tightened as the truth settled deeper. She wasn't just caught in her mother's desperation. She had become the price of a debt she'd never agreed to. Tova placed a steady hand on her shoulder, telling her they needed to act before those men reached the cabin. Lena swallowed hard, knowing the safety she'd felt moments earlier was already fading. The walls creaked as a gust swept across the cabin, and Lena felt her heartbeat quicken with every passing second. Tova knelt beside a small chest near the table and pulled out an old radio, twisting the dials until a faint crackle filled the room. Darius' jaw tightened as he listened, his eyes flickering with the kind of resolve born from long-buried guilt. Lena watched them both, trying to understand how her life had tangled so deeply into theirs. Tova finally caught a signal, static-filled voices confirming movement near the ravine. Darius looked at Lena, a silent promise in his expression that he wouldn't let her be taken. That look steadied her in a way she didn't expect. For the first time, she spoke with certainty. She didn't want to run anymore. She wanted this to end. Darius stepped away from the window, his brow furrowed in concentration as he laid out a hastily formed plan. He explained that the men were moving quickly, following the trail. Lena and Darius had left through the forest. They needed to reach a nearby outpost where Tova had contacts who could intervene. Lena listened carefully, trying not to let the fear swallow her. She had run enough. She couldn't spend the rest of her life hiding from the consequences of her mother's choices. Tova studied Lena's face with quiet understanding before nodding, telling her that this final stretch would be difficult, but she wasn't alone anymore. Lena felt something shift in her chest, a fragile but steady strength. If there was ever a moment to reclaim her life, it was now. They stepped outside into the cold air, the forest whispering with the promise of danger. Lena felt the chill seep into her bones, but she didn't falter. Darius stayed close, scanning the shadows between the trees while Tova secured the cabin door behind them. The air carried distant voices, faint but unmistakably approaching. Lena's breath stilled as she realized how close the threat had become. Darius urged them forward, guiding them toward a narrow path that curved behind the cabin. Each step felt like walking a tightrope strung between hope and fear. Lena kept her eyes fixed on the forest ahead, refusing to look back even when the snapping of branches echoed behind them. She knew turning around wouldn't save her now. As they reached the final bend in the trail, the forest opened toward a narrow road, a fragile lifeline stretching towards safety. Lena felt a surge of hope just as voices erupted behind them, sharper and closer than before. Darius spun around, placing himself between Lena and the danger without hesitation. Tova gripped Lena's arm, urging her to keep moving, but Lena stood rooted, watching the man who had once been a stranger now stand as her shield. A crack echoed through the forest. Something breaking, someone approaching fast. Darius shouted for them to run. Tova pulled Lena forward and Lena finally obeyed, sprinting onto the open road as branches snapped behind them. She didn't know what waited ahead, but for the first time she wasn't running from her life. She was running toward it.